Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending our panel on war and peace, religion and race. Our speakers today are Kidlat Tahimik, Darwin Absari, Father Albert Alejo, and Lisandro Claudio. I'm your moderator, Aurora Almendral. From the beginning of time, wars have been waged in the name of religion and race. How has the long, relentless experience of the world's conflicts, engendered by colonialism and conquest, shaped the practice of our faith and forged our sense of nation? From the local millenarian rebellions to Muslim resistance and World War II guerrilla engagement, to the issue of church and indigenous peoples and the EDSA People Power revolution, faith and national independence have been the undercurrent of many of our struggles. Kidlat Tahimik is an independent filmmaker who primarily advocates for indigenous culture amidst neo-colonialism. He has been dubbed the father of Philippine indie cinema and was conferred the prestigious Order of National Artists in the field of film and broadcast arts in 2018. Kidlat Tahimik is a hands-on artist. He directs, produces, and even acts in his films. Beyond filmmaking, he has designed and built the Likhat Artist Village in Baguio, flaunting Cordillera culture through its in-house cinema, food community, and flower shop. Darwin Absari is an assistant professor and college secretary at the UP Institute of Islamic Studies, studying Islamic thought, legacies of Islamic civilization, and Moro arts, history, society, and culture. His other research interests include pre-Hispanic Philippine history, Islam in Southeast Asia, and many others. His book, Pagtuhan, the Tausug Spiritual Tradition, was published in 2021, and he was selected as finalist for the Best Book in Spirituality and Theology during the 40th National Book Awards. Father Albert Alejo, or Paring Bert's immersion in popular spirituality and social issues during the 1970s martial law in the Philippines attracted him to the Jesuit mission of faith and justice. He co-founded the Institute of Indigenous Peoples Education, Mindanaoan Initiatives for Cultural Dialogue, Sacred Springs, Dialogue Institute on Spirituality and Sustainability, and the Amuma Cancer Support Group Foundation. He has published books on spirituality and religions, as well as 3 poetry anthologies. Paring Bert serves as board member of No Peace Without Justice while teaching at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Pontifical Georgian University in Rome. Lisandro Claudio is an intellectual and cultural historian of the Philippines. He's an associate professor at the Department of South and Southeast Asian Studies and is presently the faculty chair of Berkeley's Center for Southeast Asia Studies. His book, Liberalism and the Post-Colony, Thinking the State in 20th Century Philippines, received the 2019 George McT. Cahan Prize from the Association of Asian Studies and the 2019 European Association for Southeast Asian Studies Humanities Book Prize. Before his appointment at UC Berkeley, Claudio taught at Ateneo de Manila University and De La Salle University. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at Kyoto University's Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And I'd like to open the floor to Kidlat Tahimik. You go first.
I'm the first speaker. Okay. When I came in and the gongs were playing, I said, oh my God, I couldn't help energizing myself with the sound of gongs. When I see my fellow speakers, I'm not sure how I got into this particular panel. I'm not a political scientist with a knowledge of history of war and peace. I'm not a religious pastor or a father or a imam or a lama. I'm not a general who knows tactics and such. But I think, let me bring you into the cultural window, okay? As a national artist for film, maybe I can bring us into a cultural frame, how I see this topic. Basically, let me start with three quotations. So I also sound academic. Three quotations from people who are not usually quoted. They're off the radar because probably they don't have PhDs with them in their name. The first, just to bring to the relevance in the culture field, the first person I would like to quote is a street walker, a poet who would walk the streets of Baguio, my town, and he would write poems on park benches or on electric posts. And one day he made a graffiti on the wall. We Filipinos are freedom lovers who walked into history and never found our way out again. I like, maybe that's a start of colonization. The second indigenous person I would like to quote is my mentor, a chieftain from the Ifugao tribe. Maybe I'm not quoting him, it's more I'm mimicking him. He always mispronounced the word indigenous. He would say, we indigenous people are being laughed about by the sophisticated Manileños, or we must fight for our indigenous culture. For me, the mispronunciation, a cosmic mispronunciation, he made into one word, genius and the indigenous, and which says it all. In spite of our colonization, today the genius of the indigenous culture still is there, living, although we have a lot of colonized values which we need to change. The third, another indigenous person that I would like to quote, just to get into the cultural frame of the war and peace, is a Kalinga tribesman who, of course, the Kalingas were framed by the colonizers as savages, warlike, headhunters. But he said, how can we claim to own the land when it is the land that owns us? Okay, this is, there are several points, these are points of view that are almost common because it brings in culture as a important ingredient, whether for avoiding war or for maintaining peace. It would apply, I think, whether I think the title says religion and race, something like that. Okay, so without going into religious wars, I think the cultural difference of these three quotes are relevant to me. As a starting point, they are talking about cultural survival in the face of a invasion of a domineering culture. And eventually I will also add one really academic but well-known writer, N.V.M. Gonzalez, who I think has something which will combine all of these. Okay, when I arrived last Thursday, I passed at a newsstand and I saw that the Stern newspaper, your magazine Stern, the cover was Kulturkampf, culture fight or culture struggle. I really tried to get that copy because I thought it was relevant to my films and to what I'm doing. And maybe this is where the different points of view from cultures clash, and whether it's without bringing in religion or even race, there is already a source of tension which might be exacerbated and become a war, no? So the cultural contradictions and then create these tensions, and maybe it is also with regard to the POV, the point of view of one culture towards the land, like my third quote, Makling Dulag, how can the land own us? Because it is a sacred, we treat land as a sacred soil, no? And it's not what we have been taught by the colonizers, that land is a commodity to be traded and to be exploited. So with this mix of different POVs, I think now let me bring the writer, NVM Gonzalez, who tries to describe those who attitude towards land is sacred. NVM Gonzalez said, mythic man, he calls this the mythic man. A mythic man is content with being at home in the world and being human. But when the colonizers came, they introduced linear time, and this divided Filipinos today who are on two levels of time, the sacred and the profane. NVM Gonzalez chose, and here I'll quote from a book about this. He chose his mythic man not as the educated city dweller, but the farmer. The farmer had traversed for centuries the land that one day would be called the Philippines, named after King Philip, a very infamous, cruel king of Spain. And we still have his name until now. Maybe that's the bad karma that we have to inherit. But suddenly the farmer found that on this soil, he found that the soil he had been tilling was conferred commercial values, and that those who tilled it were called the poor. Or maybe we can also add the landless. This is a quote from my wife's book about when she discovered Philippine values, Kapwa values. I'm sure Father Alejo and I were in a Kapwa conference together, where we are an including society. Our culture, the orientation is to include the other. And this is the opposite paradigm maybe of industrial culture, where there's always something between us. Yeah, we're friends, Bert, but I'm after your job, and you're after my job. And there's always a barrier between us. And this kind of Kapwa culture is probably getting lost as we become industrialized. But I think this is a cultural attitude that might be relevant to our topic today. Okay, when Jojo Villalba, the poet who wrote poems, talk about walking into history, and then when the Spanish conquistadors introduced us to time. By the way, are you familiar with that famous dictum, time is money? Do you know who that came from? That came from Benjamin Franklin, ha ha ha. Anyway, by educating the natives that time is money, this created this start of an encounter between us that it has also become globally, where more or less often the people of color have become the poor. It's not a racial thing, but just it has evolved that way relative to the domineering class. And this has led to violent confrontations. I think this tension between these two cultural points of view is what we have read a lot with Native Americans were fighting to protect their sacred land, and from the land-grabbing colonizers. And maybe today, sorry, but the wars where the Palestinians are losing their land because a real estate developer in the White House wants to make it a Riviera of the Middle East. Well, okay, I think since I'm a filmmaker, I will go into how my film, I hope I don't dislodge the direction of your topics, no? But in my film, last night I showed my film at the Deutsche Film Museum, DFF, and I saw the Battle of Mactan, where Ferdinand Magellan, the first person to go around the world, we think, dies in the Philippines in a battle with the chieftain Lapu-Lapu. But of course, Magellan had his slave with him, and I think there's enough circumstantial evidence to say that maybe the first man to go around the world was not Magellan. It was his expedition that brought the world, that made the first trip around the world, but it was his slave who showed him the way across the Pacific. And maybe when they got to our islands, he could speak Bisaya, the language of Limasawa and Cebu. It's a circumstantial evidence that says, hey, this person who had gone around the world with his master had now returned to the island of his mother tongue. As a matter of fact, Stefan Zweig, an Austrian writer, says in his book that for the first time in the life of our planet, a human being had gone around the world and returned to the island of his mother tongue. Now, I was interested in this person, but I also got interested in Lapu-Lapu, who, in the final battle, we always just read about as children and as young people, we always read about the poor Magellan. He died at the hands of Lapu-Lapu. Now, this is the history from the Western point of view. The bad guy was our hero. When I had a installation in Madrid in 2021, the 500th anniversary of the first circumnavigation, my message to the Spanish were, hey guys, amigos, your villain is our hero, Lapu-Lapu. Now, I showed him in my film, and I'll show it in a few minutes, a short clip. But, okay, valor for the Mactan Islanders was never short, no? But I think it was Lapu-Lapu's kapwa culture, his including culture, his wish to avoid bloodshed and not just go into a battlefield with unnecessary loss of life, that he resorted to a nonviolent way to repulse the enemy. And in my film, he uses bamboo instruments. The angklong, which is like a bamboo that makes a very nice sound, and the tungatong, which we saw the other day with two bamboos that you cling. And they do a 24-hour barrage, but the Spanish are about to go crazy, but they still are there. And so finally, the islanders are brave enough, of course, to defend their island, their culture, their lifestyle, and maybe their point of view about sacred land. Because here was a conquistador who was saying, hey, we have to get over with it. So let's take a quick look. I have a short clip, about 2 minutes. Can we turn on our video?
The chieftain, Lapu-Lapu, has decided he wants to avoid a physical war and would first try to repel the invaders with the sound of bamboo instruments.
Those are the angklongs.
We shall have 1,000 warriors.
And men, women, and children will defend their culture and their island.
To ward off the invaders. But after 24 hours of such noise barrage, it becomes evident that they may have to fight a physical war. board the ship, one of the sailors panics and fires a cannon. And Lapu-Lapu has no choice. And we see a lot of blood.
So that's the end of Magellan. And my cultural framing is that because of his Kapwa culture, he wanted to avoid a war, a physical war. Now, I think I added also a gender equality victory. Lapu-Lapu is mentioned because he was written by a Spanish historian who was on that voyage, that Magellan was killed by Lapu-Lapu's forces. Now, oral literature says that Lapu-Lapu had a wife. She was a warrior. She was a leader. Her name was Bulakna. Besides that, she was also a poet and a makata and a babaylan, or a shaman, or shawoman, if there's such a word. And that she was very influential in this battle. And I think there's a film scene that I would add to this now, that the final battle scene, Lapu-Lapu is there, standing on the side, because she's also a black belter in Arnis. Arnis is the martial arts of Cebu. So I add, with my poetic license as an artist, I'm sure the historians will lynch me, but I allow that the final blow on Magellan is the black belter Bulakna. She is so adept in that field, and as the first lady, as the wife of the chief, she must have done it. So this is a cultural reframing of that battle. Maybe I would have talked also about how maybe a lot of our avoidance of bloody wars is also with the Kalingas today, with the Bodong peace pact, but that'll be for another topic. Let me just end with this by quoting my favorite historian, Yoyoy Villame. In that battle scene, many of you probably heard that song of Yoyoy. It was in 1521 when Philippines was discovered by Magellan. Anyway, the ending of his, and the battle began at dawn. Bolos and spears and guns and cannons. Mactan we could not take because Lapu-Lapu was very hard. I like Yoyoy. When Magellan was hit on the neck, he stumbled down and cried, Mother, mother, I am sick. Call the doctor very quick. Bailan, bailan, babaylan, will I die? No, my darling, do not cry. And that's the story of Magellan, ladies and gentlemen. This is a cultural framing of battles, but I'm sure our fellow speakers have other angles to this. Anyway, let's listen to history from the islanders' point of view and from our local view of the world, from our indigenous point of view. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful setting of where Magellan died. It's very enjoyable. And now we'll send it to Daniel Absari.
I was tasked to talk about the impact of religion in terms of developing a nation at the same time, to some extent, dividing the population and making them at odds with each other. Before I will show my slide, because we're talking about Spain that has really impacted the landscape of the Philippines in terms of sociocultural relationship between and among its populations. Religion in terms of bringing civilization, this can be seen when Islam came to Spain and for nearly 800 years brought riches and civilization that gave rise to European Renaissance, resulted in the Industrial and Scientific Revolution, which many people still around the world do not know about this, because there was a systematic writing out of history and a narrative that came from Europe that actually the origin of Renaissance and Scientific Revolution began in Italy and not in Islamic Spain. And the last part of the Muslim state in Spain was locked up in a bitter war against the Christian Spaniards in the north when they tried to retake back the land of the Spain from the hands of the Moors. Thus, the Reconquest came about. And the last part of the Reconquest became even bitter when the Inquisition was established by the Catholic monarchs to make Catholicism as a national religion of Spain. Thus, at the last part of the Inquisition, they have punished and eventually expelled nearly 250,000 of Muslims in Spain. In the process of that Inquisition, they were not yet still finished of their Inquisition against the Muslim in Spain and the last part of the Islamic kingdom, which is Granada in the farthest south. They have arrived the Philippines. And this is when religion is, when politicized, can destroy a nation and divide its people. When they came to the Philippines, they found Muslims. Muslims who have no connections at all with their traditional enemies in Spain, because they observed that these people practice the same practices with that of their enemies in Spain. Then they brought the wars of the Inquisition. The characteristic of the Inquisition they brought to the Philippines. Unfortunately, many of the Filipino writers do not acknowledge that what happened in the Philippines during the long Spanish evangelization was actually an extension of the Inquisition in Spain. Thus, they have erased all ancient manuscripts and punished thinkers like the Babaylan and the Lalakayan. Thus, at the last part of the Spanish conquest, there was a search for identity, which Rizal lamented the loss of ancient nationality. Everything was lost. Everything was borrowed. In Rizal, when he wrote his Century Hence and the Indolence of the Filipino People, he lamented the loss of ancient nationality. And in the last part of his life, he tried to regain the ancient nationality. And in my slide, you will see one of the events. This is in 1876, the burning of Jolo, the seat of Islamic government in pre-Hispanic Philippines. The whole town was razed to the ground after the Spanish attacked that small island and killed as many as they can. Now, this is only one of the wars that the Spain waged against the Muslims for 375 years. Unfortunately, using the native converts to fight against the Muslims. Thus, until today, if you go to the Philippines, the relationship between the Muslims and the Christianized in the north and in the Visayas remains at odds, which I consider to be almost the permanent legacy of Spain. And this division, this polarization that is caused by no less than religion that is supposed to embrace and bring civilization, remains to be what I call the greatest calamity. For us to move forward, this is the main hindrance. Because until today, if you go to the Philippines, our government is still fighting with the Muslims in the south who continue to aspire for their independence. And the money our government is spending against the Muslims is a lot. There was even a time when the country went bankrupt because of the expenses that the government has incurred in their war against the Muslims in the South. On the other hand, religion can also build partnership. Religion can also a bridge and a healing instrument, as can be seen in the next slide, please. There was also a time in our history when Muslims and Christians fought alongside each other, regardless of religion, when a sense of nationalism became more dominant than the religious differences. When the country was invaded by the Japanese in 1941 to 1945, the Muslims, despite their sentiments against the national government and against their Christian brethren, whom was used by the Spaniards to fight against them, the Muslims fought alongside the Christians and alongside the Americans. This was not because of the manipulation of the American government, but this was because of the sense of nationalism that is still and remain dominant within the consciousness of the Filipino people. And in this photo, you see a Muslim guerrilla fighters against the Japanese. And they have succeeded in their war against the Japanese. 6 months before MacArthur returned to the Philippines, Mindanao was already liberated against the Japanese. And MacArthur escaped to Australia by way of Mindanao, an area controlled by the Muslims. So our history in the Philippines has been love and hate relationship in terms of its, dealings with and among its population. But what I'm trying to say is religion can be devastating when politicized, which we still experience until today. At the same time, religion can be a healing process if religion will be presented as something that is universalistic and something that is embracing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now it's for Paring Bert.
I'll stand up. Hello. So I'm Father Albert Alejo, Jesuit priest, born in Mindanao. And as a Jesuit, I worked in Mindanao for almost 20 years, dialoguing with the Muslims, the indigenous peoples, and the communist rebels, aside from working against corruption. We'll have to move fast because we have plenty of slides. Next. My question now is, in particular, should the Catholic Church in the Philippines also say sorry to indigenous peoples? And there's a missing word here, now. We are asking the question at this time of history. Next. Why also? Please, next. Why also? Because in year 2000, Pope John Paul II apologized to the Lord for the church's sins against different sectors, including the indigenous peoples. Please. So he says, Christians have often denied the gospel, yielding to a mentality of power, which was part of colonialism. The mentality of power accompanying colonialism. We violated the rights of ethnic groups and peoples and shown contempt for the cultures and religious traditions of the different countries. Next. Now, but actually, other religious groups and congregations have earlier expressed their apologies. Next. For example, next. 1988 response, apology to the indigenous peoples by a particular group. Next. For example, in Canada, the Canadian Oblates of Mary Immaculate said, sorry, we apologize for the part we played in the cultural, ethnic, linguistic, religious imperialism that was of the mentality within which the peoples of Europe first met the Aboriginal peoples. We say sorry. Next. At the Anglican Church also, not just the Catholic, represented by Archbishop Michael Pierce said, I have felt shame and humiliation as I have heard of suffering inflicted by my people and my church. I accept and confess before God, we failed you. We failed ourselves and we failed God. Next. The Jesuits said, intuitively we know that there is a lot of good in every culture, but unfortunately, we have not always followed this intuition. And we have not always recognized that aggression and coercion have no place. We contributed to the alienation of the very people we wanted to serve. And this is 1996, prior to Pope John Paul II apology. Next. The Franciscans also said, we ask forgiveness of the Mayan people for not having understood your worldview and your religion and for having denied your deities. Take note, for not having respected your culture and for having imposed upon you for many centuries a religion that you did not understand, and we impose a religion that you could not understand. So it's a whole series of centuries and decades of misunderstanding. The church people saying, we impose a religion that you could not absorb, and we denied your religion, we demonized your religion before even trying to understand. Next. The Archbishop of Canterbury apologizes to indigenous peoples of Canada. Next. Pope Francis, very recently, before he died, personally conveyed apologies to the indigenous peoples of Canada. He said, I myself wish to reaffirm this with shame and unambiguously, I humbly beg for forgiveness for the evil committed by so many Christians against the indigenous peoples. Next. Now, the question now is, what about the Philippine church in the Philippines now? Should we say sorry for that kind of sin committed by the colonialists? So are we supposed to say sorry also at this time? So the Philippine church should also say sorry, somebody said, for a widespread impact on the church and the Christianized indigenous communities. Now, text. Next. 10 years after John Paul II, there was a meeting of Catholic Bishops' Conference in the Philippines, and I was asked to facilitate. 50 bishops attended. Next. So they were apprehensive. Why should we say sorry for the sins of our predecessors? And what would be the impact? And who, let's discuss. And when I sensed that sentiment, I framed the discussion in three ways, with 3 R's. Because these are their apprehensions. Wait a minute, who are the IPs? Some of them are already baptized, some became Muslims. Can we judge previous missionary approaches according to our present missiological categories? Now we are more culturally sensitive. But during that time, can we apply our postmodern theories to what happened before? Okay, next. So there have been many questions. How do we know how do we express our sorry? Is there a particular ritual? But there are many tribes. And how do we know we are forgiven? Is there a particular representative of the different indigenous peoples who can say, we forgive you? So I framed the discussion with 3 R's. What do we reaffirm in the church's history? And what do we regret? And what are we ready to do, given this situation? The context is that in many struggles of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines, some church, clergy, and sisters and lay leaders are already part of the struggle. Next. And so, summary of the workshop. Next. The bishop says, what do we reaffirm? The work of and scholarship of missionaries, we affirm. Unlike in South America, where the Spaniards imposed Spanish, in the Philippines, they hesitated, they refused to spread Spanish because the Filipinos might learn liberal ideologies like in the South America. So what happened? The missionaries compiled dictionaries of different languages. Now we have them. pastoral work of the diocese with the humanitarian work, we affirm that. Involvement in the education of IPs, scholarship, yes, we affirm that. And cultural preservation to some extent. Next. But we also regret the lack of understanding and the distance from the indigenous peoples. Loss of writing, we acknowledge that and we regret having committed that. Discriminatory practices and attitudes, imposing, especially in the Catholic schools, failure to stress social teachings of the church, and pressure of IPs pushing them afar, paternalism and dole-outs of missionaries, from especially European missionaries, who have access to donations from the West. When the diocesan priests take over, they don't have that kind of access. And cultural exploitation. Next. So what do? Revise our catechesis, establish indigenous people's desk, integral evangelization, closer collaboration with NGOs. Next. And so, the Philippine bishops meet with tribal leaders and warn against destructive development. Nowadays, some bishops and priests are in the forefront of dialoguing with indigenous peoples against the development aggression. To the point that when I was doing fieldwork in Mount Apo, I was not accepted because you are a Catholic priest, you are against development. So you are always protesting, we might get militarized. Next. So in some parts of Mindanao and other parts of the Philippines, the church now, especially because of the encyclical Laudato Si, are also in the forefront of ecological preservation. Next. Church calls on the rights body, media to heed plea of tribal group in Boracay. Even the missionaries of Mother Teresa are involved with the indigenous peoples in Boracay. So many of you probably wish to go to Boracay for the beautiful beach, but actually the indigenous peoples, the Aitas there, are deprived of their land. And some sisters, instead of just taking care of the sick and the dying, they also take care of the Aitas there. Next. So right now, the Indigenous People Sunday, every October of the year, we celebrate the Indigenous Peoples Sunday. Next. And so we also had another conference, and there we invited the Cardinal, and we had to confront this question. Next. During his homily, he said, we need evangelizing without cultural violence. The issue is how to evangelize without doing violence to their culture. Culture, by definition, changes upon contact with another culture. Next. He said, okay, we need to apologize for the things we need to apologize, but he says, we must not apologize for sharing with them the gospel of Christ, but yes, we must ask forgiveness for not acting like Jesus, for not being Christian. We want to make them Christian, but we are not Christian at all in our behavior. So we need to apologize for that part. Next. We must not apologize for sharing with them the fruits of development. Many Filipinos learn how to sing using the microphone in the church. But yes, we must ask forgiveness for teaching them the ways of greed and selfishness. And this is very prominent in many of the posh Catholic schools. Next. We must not apologize for making them members of the church, if they so wish. But yes, we must ask forgiveness for the abuses some leaders of the church may have inflicted on them, especially their young and their women. There's church scandals, yes. Next. So we need healing. We ask forgiveness for moments when we taught Christianity as a religion robed with colonial cultural superiority instead of sharing it as a religion that calls for a relationship with God and a way of life. Next. And so right now, the question is, should we say sorry? What happens if we say the church is totally at fault? The mining companies might say, oh, your allies are at fault. No. So it's kind of attention. Next. So points for reflection. We need to do a different kind of theology, philosophical, political, historical, anthropological, and it goes down to personal conversion. Next.
Do we have, can we wrap
Maybe I
up?
should stop there. Okay, thank you very much.
That's a good moment. Thank you. So, Lisandro, Claudio.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it within 5 minutes so I have time for question and answer. I just want to start off by saying that these discussions have been discussions about imperialism, xenophobia, colonialism, and I was very touched that Kidlat already brought up the example of Gaza, because the logic that's happening in the Philippines is not too dissimilar to the logic that has occurred and that has informed war crimes in Gaza. And I'm very proud that the Philippines has given space for those issues to be brought up here, because our experiences are not too dissimilar from the experiences of the people, the Palestinians in Gaza. So I want to begin by just saying something about, just talking about the Catholic Church, because I want to build on what Paring Bert said. And I want to quote Rizal. Rizal described the friar, I think he was mostly describing Dominicans, Paring Bert, not Jesuits, as the mean egoist and the Carlist. So Carlist, a kind of reactionary from that period, and against all liberal progress. In a sense, Rizal was being fair because in the 19th century, many of the friars who had arrived in the Philippines were the kind of gold-digging friars who were in the Philippines, partly because it was easy to go to the Philippines in the 19th century. The Suez Canal had already opened. And two, because the Philippines was increasingly wealthy in the 19th century. The problem with Rizal was that he equated that 19th century friar with the 16th century friar. The 16th century friar would have been very different from the 19th century friar, because the 16th century friar gave up his entire life to move to the Philippines and dedicated his whole life there because it was very difficult to go to the Philippines at that time. In the 16th century friar, particularly the Dominicans, were inspired by the philosophy of two particular thinkers. One was Bartolome de las Casas, Father Bartolome de las Casas, who advocated for the rights of indigenous people and actually believed that the king had no right to colonize indigenous people. This thinking was also informed by a Jesuit, Francisco Suarez, who was against the divine right of kings and who, like de las Casas, was also an advocate of indigenous rights. The perfect example of this kind of thinking was Domingo Salazar, the Bishop of Manila, who left Manila to go to Spain. This was called the Salazar Mission, and he begged the Spanish king to ensure the rights of the native people against the encomenderos. So this is a very different image of the friar. And I want to think of the history of the Catholic Church relative to indigenous people, the rights of natives, in terms of these two phases. The first phase is the phase that Rizal discussed, the mean egoist. And the second phase is the phase of Domingo Salazar. And I would posit that the history of the Catholic Church relative to these groups has always been informed by these two phases. So let's think about Zamboanga, for example. In 1635, Zamboanga, which was Moro territory, land of Muslim Filipinos, was effectively colonized by a Spanish mission and was led by the Jesuits. The Jesuits were the main jingoists there, even if the Spanish colonial state actually said, we have no money to engage in the Moro Wars. And this is written, the historian Cesar Mahul writes about this episode beautifully. That's the first phase. That kind of represents the kind of mean egoist priest that Rizal's talking about. The second phase is represented by priests like Paring Bert, who are trying to make a difference in places like Zamboanga and who have even talked about the notion of apology. And I would say Paring Bert, maybe, as a comment, the easiest thing to do is maybe not an apology from the entire Catholic Church, but to begin with the Jesuits, because the Jesuits are, I think, more capable of doing that and more open-minded to doing that. And if you can do that within your structures, it kind of sets an example. So I want to end there. I just want to talk about these two phases of Catholicism relative to these phenomena and maybe open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have a question from the audience? Okay, here. This one.
Hi, my name is Edward from Mindanao, within the Bangsamoro. Um, I just wanted to know, to highlight also the minorities' perspective in the indigenous peoples in the Bangsamoro. For instance, before the advent of Islam, there were indigenous peoples also who were resist about the colonization of Islam brought by Makdum and Sheikh Makdum and Sharif Kabungsuan. And in fact, in terms with the historical injustices, my tribe, Tadurai, I am Tadurai, also experienced historical injustices in the Islam hand. And at the time, the contribution of Jesuits was they helped also indigenous peoples to get indigenous peoples from the slavery of Datus, for instance, Datu Piang, Datu, and other Datus. So my question is, in historical portrayal of Mindanao, we are actually struggling our experiences to like go out because of the influence of the majority perspective about Mindanaoan people, because we are minority within minority. How would you ensure that presentation about Mindanao would be inclusive as much as possible?
To whom you address the question, sir? To me? Okay. Let me go back to the Islamization process and the thing about some indigenous people resisted those Muslim preachers. If you look at Islamization process, those who brought Islam to the Philippines were not the same with that of those who brought Christianity to the Philippines. Those who brought Christianity to the Philippines were backed up by the government. They were funded. They came with military. They came with ships. Those who brought Islam to the Philippines were individuals. They were simply preachers. And they came without funding. They came without ships, without military backings. Maybe this is the reason why, let's say they did not impose or fight against the natives because in the first place they were alone. Maybe. Or maybe because their kind of religion that was inculcated to them was a kind of religion that is universalistic and tolerant. A religion that was not polluted with politics, for example. Although if you look at the early relationship between Islam and Christianity back in Spain, it was not as bitter as what we learned during the last phase of the Reconquest and Inquisition. In terms of the including the narratives of the indigenous, for example, in the historical injustices, for example, the BAM government has one commission and one parliament representing the indigenous people. I think this is a very good platform for the rights of the indigenous people to be heard in the regional government and thus be elevated in the national government. I understand how the indigenous people, some indigenous people in Mindanao have been sidelined, not only by the Muslims, but by the Imperial Manila first, and now with the rise of the BAM government being administered by the Muslims, I understand there are some sentiments. But this new development of setting up a parliament, a representative for the Bangsamoro indigenous people. By the way, the definition of Bangsamoro does not only include about the Muslims. Bangsamoro means tribe people. The Muslims who have been there since time immemorial, the indigenous people, the Christians, and the indigenous people. So I like what you have asked, and I want to bring you home this kind of advocacy. Let's raise the awareness of the Muslims by also looking at the rights of the indigenous people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Darwin. We have just a couple of minutes left. Would you prefer to take another question from the audience, or does somebody have a burning response to add? Okay. All right.
So the question is how. I recognize that the indigenous peoples, the Tiduray Lambangian, would like to have an autonomy within the autonomous region of Bangsamoro. And so the question of how can be answered, one, by introducing a new concept. When the Bangsamoro law was being drafted, bill, we had to introduce the concept of non-Moro indigenous peoples. Meaning, yes, they are part of Moro, the area, but they are not Moro. So that is an assertion which somehow got into the law. So, but there were plenty of, we had to struggle with that together with the leaders of the Tidurais to insert some phrases into the Bangsamoro legislation. Now, another more important thing, I think, is in changing the curriculum. And we'll have to discuss that tomorrow when I present the Mindanao History Timeline infographics. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think that might be all the time that we have, but I thank all the panelists for this very sort of multi-layered tapestry of the Philippines and the history of race and struggle there, religion and struggle. Thank you so much.